Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, writer Anton Jäger discusses his new book, Hyperpolitics, with Masoud Golsorki and Thomas Rouchet.
So welcome, Anton.
Thank you for having me.
It's lovely to have you here at Tank. We've both loved your book. I've read it more than once. I also really love the cover. You're just saying how successful a cover it's been.
Yes, clearly it sells purely on the basis of cover. That's the ideal scenario you want as a writer.
Maybe we should do some blank versions.
Yes,
yeah,
so people can have it as a souvenir
yeah.
and keep it in their kitchen or something. Yeah.
Thank you. No, I thought it was an incredibly brilliant and incredibly timely book. But maybe we can set up by you describing what hyperpolitics is and what the terms means to you and how it come to be.
So I'm going to give a quite convoluted technical definition, but it's very short. Hyperpolitics means repoliticization without reinstitutionalization. Just 3 words in which you can capture the concept. But what that means concretely is that it describes a change in political culture broadly in what I would call the West, so Europe and the US, even though you can make claims about how it applies globally as well in the last 10 to 15 years. And that change in political culture indicates that there's been an increase in political activity on a number of metrics. There's some very visible ones, let's say voter turnout. You can also look at protest activity. So the 2010s are estimated to be the decade in human history in which humans protested the most. It's just a spectacular increase, certainly compared to the 90s and 2000s. And that obviously invites a lot of comparisons. So people tend to think that we're going back to the 20th century, that the 1930s are returning, which is understandable because a lot of that political activity has benefited, let's say, forces on the far right of the political spectrum. But one element that complicates this analogy is precisely that much of this political activity has not gone hand in hand with the creation of new institutional structures. So you can look at the graph for political engagement, protest activity, election turnout, but obviously how people profile themselves politically on social media. But then if you look at the indices for union membership, party membership, just civil society organization in general, there we see an accelerated decline. And it's even visible, let's say, in religious institutions in the US, which is supposed to be one of the last bulwarks of religiosity. And this is really what the book is trying to capture. What are the dynamics of political engagement, particularly in the 2020s? What are their long-term roots? And how are they different from the 90s and the 2000s, which were the era of what is often called post-politics, and the 20th century, which was the era of mass politics, in which there was a lot of political activity as well, high polarization, but in which that political activity usually took a very visibly institutional form. To be engaged in politics meant to be part of an institution or an organization, whether it's a party or any other type of institution. And that is not the case in the 2010s and 2020s. It's now possible to be politically active outside of that institutional context. And that leads to all kinds of confusing and unexpected situations, which I think the book also tries to analyze. I mean, one element that's quite visible is that the 1990s and 2000s were really characterized by a kind of privatization of the political, where political preferences or your political opinions were considered something that is private, that you don't necessarily have to share publicly. I think there's a very visible manifestation of this, that people do not like to talk about who they vote for anymore. And across the 20th century, that's a marked contrast, not just, let's say, in my home country of Belgium, but across the world. It was very visible who you voted for, because there was a sort of public marker that indicated that the line between public and private was very visible. And it also meant that, let's say, a lot of the political institutions that structured politics across the 20th century had a very strong say about what people did in their private lives as well. So if you were a member of the French Communist Party, there were certain cars you couldn't drive. If you were a member of, let's say, a Christian Democratic Party, there obviously were consequences for what happened in the bedroom as well. And that really ends in the 1990s and 2000s, where people are liberated from these public demands, and there's a separation between how you relate to politics privately and a public sphere that mostly becomes dominated by, let's say, media debates exclusively. I think that has changed in the last 10 to 15 years. So the boundaries between public and private are blurring again. I think the digital or the internet has played a really prominent role in effacing or at least blurring this boundary. And I think it's also crucial for the type of politics I'm trying to describe there, where politics again enters into people's private lives, but not as, let's say, the dictate or the demand of a public institution, but something much more diffuse and individualistic.
The disconnect between politicization and political consequences happened in a very specific way at a very specific time frame. Can you just maybe talk about one or two of them and how that process kind of happened in the first place? What were the actualities that kind of gave that result?
So there's a very easy way of tracking when this change in political culture actually takes off, and it's just 2008. So 2008 really is the cutoff point. It's the start of the global financial crisis. That obviously begins as an American crisis, so it begins as a crisis in American credit markets, but then it spirals out into Europe. It then becomes a global crisis. It's very clear that something like the Arab Spring should also be read as one of the first effects of this crisis. And it leads to a really significant increase, first of protest activity, not just in Northern Africa, but then also in parts of Southern Europe and even in the US. And then also in the end in Western Europe. So there, I mean, the detonator for this entire process really is 2008. It's not easy to track each of its effects. You can see, for example, that the election of Donald Trump in 2016 can even be read as a late consequence of the crash. But that is really, I think, what ends the 1990s and the 2000s.
You call it the long 90s?
Well, yes, the long 90s begin in 1989, then you could say they last until 2008. There obviously is a bit of variation, or there are changes in the 2000s, but it's really the crisis of 2008 that ends this. And it leads to a really enormous surge in protest activity across the 2010s. And a couple of really spectacular examples. For example, the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020 are estimated to be the largest in American history. So the highest estimates say there were about 25 million participants. If you calculate it, that would be 1/10 or let's say 10% of the American adult population at that time. So these are really spectacular numbers.
Compared to the civil rights movement.
Yes, it's larger.
It's hugely,
It's larger than the civil rights movement. The comparison with the civil rights movement is interesting because both of them were very, I'd say, visible, very prominent protest movements, but they take on a very, very different form insofar as the BLM protests of the summer of 2020 are enormously energetic, very populous and widespread for a couple of months, but once they're over, people disperse and they don't, let's say, go back to certain organizations.
They don't lead to anything. They didn't affect legislative or
no. So there are a couple of short-term legacies. There's the defunding of certain police departments. There's the putting forward of certain bills within Congress around police violence. But then if you look at the effects 4 to 5 years later, you see that all the police departments that have been defunded have regained or even increased their funding. And at
New
the same
York,
time,
I think, is an example of one.
Yes, and many of the social problems that were seen as targets within the summer of 2020, whether it's the scandal of mass incarceration or the enormously high numbers of police violence, which the US is known for, particularly among developed nations, many of them have actually gotten worse. And I think this is a sort of striking contrast between the largest protest movement in American history that manages to mobilize an enormous number of people over a very short span of time and then leaves very little institutional or policy legacies half a decade later.
It crystallizes the idea of hyper.
Yes, I think it is really a very telling example.
I was going to ask, do you think traditional politics died and hyperpolitics kind of took over, or was it hyperpolitics that killed traditional politics? Was it the chicken or the egg? Was it a kind of consequence of What was your question?
I was going to ask a slightly different question, which was just about, I guess, the place of culture. I think in many ways, and leading on from the example of BLM, many of the ways in which that seems to be litigated or in which some forms of change happened were maybe in questions of visibility or representation.
I'll do the question about culture first, and then I'll come to the natural death of the murder question. So This book is a kind of awkward hybrid in that it's somewhere between social science and literary essayism. Some people find this slightly annoying and say, well, it's just a data dump with then a couple of sort of literary lines around it. Other people say that it is a sort of essay that tries to make certain social scientific claims but is not very rigorous. I think I'll just plead guilty on both counts. But one of the reasons why I did want to turn this into more of an essay than a sort of dry Paul Tsai article is that I think you can give people the data, you can give them the statistics, you can give them the sort of hard-nosed, rigorous analysis. But what's, interesting about using some of the photographs, for example, by Wolfgang Tillmans, or talking a lot about a novelist as well. So there's passages on Annie Ernaux, so the French Nobel Prize winner. There's a lot on Michel Houellebecq, so the French writer who plays a very prominent role across some of the chapters. And one of the benefits is just brevity. So I could spend 10 pages explaining what post-politics is and how you can trace it, or I could give you one paragraph of Ernaux, or I could give you a couple of sentences from Houellebecq, and it evokes an entire epoch in a very short period of time, because not only are they stylistically brilliant, but at the same time they are also inevitably symptoms of their time in a very useful way. So I can just show you an oeuvre or a book that is inevitably a product of its time, even if it transcends it. And it's not just more pleasant to read, but it's also a much easier way of explaining what I'm talking about, rather than giving you reams and reams of data that would be very lifeless and dry. At the same time, there is also a reason why the book focuses on culture and why Tillmans is such a prominent figure, particularly at the opening of the book, which I think has to do with the fact that indeed a lot of the new political activity has singled out the domain of culture as one of the privileged sites in which politicization, as the book calls it, has to happen. So let's say imagery, performance, visibility, a certain type of ritual is just enormously important for contemporary politics, which I think partly has to do with the reduced costs of political expression. So if it's possible for you to share your political opinion online, that makes it very easy, but it also makes it very cheap, and it invites, let's say, performative or certain types of contestation that are more about the visual rather than, let's say, substantive policy change. But at the same time, what you also feel is that in the 90s and the 2000s, you have a section of people, and Tillmans, I think, is very much part of this generation, that really experienced this so-called post-politics, or the separation between a public and a private sphere, as a liberation. And I think he's a living testimony to the fact that
so it's just a way of like having living history as it's felt, as well as it's kind of conceived or conceptualized. Yeah.
Yes, and he is, I think, a perfect incarnation of the promises of the 90s and the 2000s, what became possible. And he then, I'd say, realizes in the 2010s that this type of emancipation or this type of life is no longer feasible, and he feels pressured to engage in politics, whereas before he thought he was completely free or liberated from politics. And for example, he famously designs a couple of posters for the Remain campaign here in 2016, and I think they really encapsulate the uneasiness of his attempt to move from the post-political 90s into the hyper-political 2010s, because he's not quite sure what kind of propaganda or what kind of political campaign he's actually engaged in. And it's somewhere between the aesthetic and then the militant. And once again, it's just a perfect way of illustrating a contradiction that would take, let's say, chapters to explain if I had to do it in purely textual terms.
Yeah, no. It really reminded me of Sloterdijk and the kind of concept of foam, the idea of kind of like, social material that's kind of looks substantial, but it's kind of ineffectual.
Well, it has pictures of the sea, so you see, let's say, parts of the North Sea and the waves crashing, and it has this sort of really ethereal, also liquid feeling to it. Yeah. And then on the natural death and the murder question, I think that's a complicated debate, and you have to sort of assign a specific proportion to each of them. I think part of it is natural death. What we could say is that you have a patient that's on its deathbed, and then someone comes along and sort of delivers the last blow. But there is a cultural story that's often told about the end of 20th century mass politics, which is captured by the term individualization. People just develop a different relationship to public institutions. They can't tolerate it, that they make these very strong demands on their private lives, and thereby they just leave or exit. I think that is definitely part of the story. It's also generationally told as a way of people who grew of age or came of age in the 70s and 80s who say, I do not want parties or, let's say, other institutions to take up that role in my life. At the same time, that I think is too easy or organic a story to really explain why there's such a sudden cutoff point in 1989. Because the 70s and 80s, also in Britain, are a period of still intense politicization. There are a lot of parties that are founded. There's a lot of political activity. Think of the early 80s and the miners' strike here in Britain. And it's really in the late 80s, early 90s that you suddenly get a really dramatic drop. And that cannot be a story of gradual organic change. That has to be an account how certain political decisions pushed people out of organized collective life and almost condemned them to privacy. And I think that's more the murder part than it is the natural death part, insofar as there was a destruction of collective life that was actively pursued by a series of governments. There is just repression that also happens. And I think you only see the effects of that operation, of this so-called controlled demolition of the public sphere, as the book calls it, in the 2010s, when people go out in the streets again and want to make demands on their governments, but they realize that the old channels of representation and pressure are no longer as open or available as they used to be.
Absolutely. As somebody who's lived through that process, I can attest to the fact that a sequence of successive defeats, the printers' strike before the miners' strike, then the final, when Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher said, Tony Blair is my ultimate product. Is that, because the right had captured all sides of politics, not just its side, and in a way kind of made political kind of impossible, at least in the UK.
Yes, I mean,
because both parties adopted essentially the same politics.
I think it's a British story, but I think it applies in different variations across Europe and in the US as well.
You alluded to this. To what extent is this like a Western European or a kind of Anglo-Saxon fear kind of story, or is it as neat as that or not?
I'm afraid I have to confess that it's a bit of a provincial book in that regard, and it's just a product of a set of constraints, namely my linguistic and cultural grasp of these contexts. So I quote very widely from different European literatures, whether it's French, German, also a bit of Dutch, Belgian, and then also English, and then particularly some American material. But my fluency in other languages and my knowledge of, let's say, extra or non-European context is simply too limited to make very confident pronouncements about it. What I have noticed when I've spoken to people who've read the book from within a zone that's not exclusively Western, that they feel that it does apply to many of the histories that they have lived through in the last 40 to 50 years. So I speak to people from Eastern Europe, or even people with a Russian background or Latin American, and then particularly Middle Eastern background. They say, well, I mean, there is a hyper-political story to be told for my country as well, which gives me hope that the hypothesis I'm putting forward is not just applicable to that exclusive Western context, and can be globalized to a cautious extent. But once again, it's not a task I can fulfill. Other people will have to do it for me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems as though there's that kind of decrease in institutionalization does seem to be fairly global. It doesn't seem like there are obvious examples that one could reach to in which mass movements are building institutions.
No, I mean, you could look at the example of India, the BJP, for example, which in the end is the largest mass party that's still extant. There are examples in Latin America. I'd say China is a really spectacular counterfactual to what I'm talking about, is that a large part of the developmental miracle or the history of China in the last 30 years could not be told without mentioning this very specific institution called the Chinese Communist Party. And it's, I think, the presence, both authoritarian but also, let's say, within society, that is really crucial in understanding why China has taken such a different route from particularly parts of the West and the rest of the globe.
The interesting thing is that in the long 90s, China pretty much followed Western idiom, and they took it for granted that the neoliberal solution was the only one. It was only in 2009 when Obama went for that visit and asked for austerity. I happened to be in China, and I remember reading the answer that the then Chinese premier gave, which was, we're having, like, I think they were having a dozen riots a week.
Exactly.
In China over land.
Yeah.
It was like, as much as we think you're right, we just
Yeah.
can't afford to impose austerity at this point.
Yes. Yeah.
And then that's when they kind of veered the opposite direction.
No, and it's a great example because we know that there's a lot of labor unrest throughout the 2010s. The official numbers don't register this, but it was very widespread. But at the same time, China, unlike parts of the West, didn't have a populism or like a hyperpolitics problem in the 2010s. What COVID, I think, also allowed for is that it reinserted the party into society in a particularly invasive way. But it tells you the institutionalization story from the other side insofar as it shows what institutionalization does look like in the 21st century, whereas in the rest of the world, so much of the recent politics we've seen...
It demonstrated their institutions work.
Exactly,
for one thing.
yes. I mean, and if you look at the growth rates, or let's say the developmental miracle that's happened, it clearly is related also to this institutional story.
I'm really interested in the idea of performance and kind of performativeness, which you touch on at every level. Do you think it is possible to capture performance in the service of actual politics? Or is it kind of by definition poison the well forever?
Well, I think this is a difficult question insofar as politics since, I mean, modern popular or mass politics since the 19th century has always had this performative dimension. So it's not as if you can simply exclude it from the repertoire of political action. I think what is striking with, let's say, the performative dimension of politics in the 2010s, there's now a capacity to think that politics is purely performative. And I think that is a new development. So to say that politics has this performative dimension, I think is almost a truism. I mean, it seems unlikely that you can even think of mobilization or the creation of a popular coalition without an element of performance. But precisely because there are now these technological tools at your disposal that make it very, very easy for you to express yourselves politically. So you just have to think about what would it take for you to express a political opinion 50 to 60 years ago if you didn't have access to a newspaper editor, or you couldn't write a letter to the reader's column, or you had to stand in the middle of the square and take a megaphone and start shouting, or print your own leaflets, or share your opinions on the pub. What particularly the internet has enabled is, I think, a lowering of the costs of political expression at the same time that it's individualized.
Yeah.
And it invites, I think, a relationship to politics that is almost exclusively performative, where you say, if I share the black square on my Instagram page, or if I indicate my concern for this or that cause, and then I've basically discharged my political duty, or I've done my duty as a political citizen, that I think is something quite new. And it has to do with the structure of our new public sphere, where people are both more vocal but also more individual. So they're angrier, but they're also more disorientated, as the book says. And this, I think, makes for an exclusively performative conception of politics, which I think was latent but never fully present previously.
Is there a kind of cyclical sense whereby, I mean, I feel like it's interesting that a lot of the protest movements that have been so large, I mean, again, BLM is an example, but that have kind of felt as though they've culminated in forms of defeat, or that they haven't gone anywhere, perhaps because of this lack of institutionalization. Does that then make the problem worse? You know?
Yes, I think the refusal, but I think more incapacity to institutionalize, because we have to keep in mind that it's not just a question of people not wanting to create institutions, but also the difficulty in actually shaping them in an environment in which people are both more distracted, but also the limits on institutions are just very publicly visible. Just think about Keir Starmer's Labour Party, which prefers to rule without a mass membership. He very openly said, if you don't like it, you can leave. And he very clearly clarified to people that he wanted them to leave. But it does indeed invite protest activity as the exclusive tool within the armory of political options. So if you can see that there's no institutional channel for you to pursue, you then go back to the next protest, or you descend on the square again, because it doesn't seem as if anything else is available. So in that sense, it is also an expression of powerlessness or helplessness, insofar as many of the other tools have simply become too difficult to use. And I want to make clear that this is not just a story about the left. So with BLM or the protest movement, so the Indignados or Occupy in the early 2010s, there you can very clearly see how there is a massive surge in political activity, but then it doesn't institutionalize or changed the power balance to a very significant extent. But also on the right, there is, let's say, a hyper-political problem in that the right has seen surges of protest in the last 10 to 15 years, but the question does remain what type of social change it's brought. So take, for example, the Unite the Kingdom march that took place last summer here in the UK. People made the comparison in terms of turnout of that march to previous far-right marches. So the BNP has these sort of cyclical demonstrations they held on London, let's say every year in the 90s and the 2000s. The upward limit for that was 10,000 attendance. Now we're talking about 150,000 people who descended on London together. But at the same time, there's a real difference in form between those old and those new marches. The old marches consisted of people who had a shared history within certain, let's say, far-right goon squads or, let's say, BNP organizations. They met in pubs, they might have gone to lectures, or they might have gone to
supported the same football club.
Exactly, part of the same hooligan or football clubs. And then they came to London together, and they would know each other from before the march, and they would know each other after the march.
So there was a kind of community, sense of community before they entered the arena.
There is, I mean, let's say a civil society on the right, particularly, let's say, the Tories or the British Conservative Party was the first mass party in Western history. So in the 50s, the Tories had more members than Labour actually did. So for a long time, this was a really significant mass party with a really dense organizational infrastructure. But what happens with the United Kingdom march is that you have people who might follow the same influencers, listen to the same podcasts, be in the same Telegram channels, and then join for that day and march together in London, but then they disperse and they don't join an organization or get a membership card afterwards.
It's interesting.
This is something quite new, and it's also a problem on the right.
Because the right loves to talk about political correctness. It's one of their favorite political footballs. But it's interesting that your critique of, I think, the idea that the personal killed the political in a traditional sense, it's coming from a very unusual place, because the right has been criticizing the idea of like personalization of politics for 30, 40 years, and had been losing consistently, even the very latest. The fact that there are so many black and brown people in far-right parties everywhere is a demonstration of that, for example.
And I think so. The book is called Politicization Without Political Consequences, or that's a subtitle. I think it's an uneasy description of what I'm talking about. It was partly an idea of the original German publisher of the book, because he thought it was snappy. I think I do need to nuance it to some extent, in that there are some consequences to hyperpolitics, and a lot of the change that much of this hyperpolitical activity has ushered in is discursive or cultural. So there have been really significant victories on the cultural front. So if you look at, for example, tolerance for interracial dating or marriage in the US since BLM, the numbers are spectacular. They've gone up really, really rapidly. So Americans are objectively more anti-racist than they were before. So it's not as if on the attitudinal level nothing has changed. But what you have is this horrid paradox where you have a society in which an enormous number of black men are incarcerated, police violence still hits them most heavily, but a society which is officially committed to some form of anti-racism in larger and larger numbers. And this means that the disconnect between the actual social reality of racial inequality and then the official discourse of anti-racism is very stark. And I think this holds for a lot of the hyperpolitical activism we can look at, is that it affects people's attitudes and, let's say, their view of the world, but it doesn't necessarily translate into institutional change. So there's a latent or an ambient opposition or aversion to all kinds of social problems, but there aren't necessarily any sort of concrete direct effects on the power balance.
They used to say in the 80s that the left won the cultural argument and the right won the economic argument. It turns out that actually both lost both sets of arguments in reality. How do you see this? It's actually kind of really fascinating. Like the far right party in Germany is led by an Iranian, or has a
indeed
Iranian.
And the female leader has, let's say, I think, a Thai
African ties, and who are like the first people who are like lining up to stop other, migrants coming in, and same reflected as elsewhere. How do you define this particular adoption and then this disavowalment, or can you say they both embrace racist ideas and then disavow them publicly?
I think it just indicates that, as you say, there have been certain cultural achievements in terms of the creation of a new civic community in which certain ethnic minorities now just have a much firmer place. So the boundaries between different ethnic groups have actually decreased in the last 20 to 30 years to that extent, and the right just has to accept that that is the new domain. And I think you even see it with Reform UK, is that there apparently is a disconnect between the number of ethnic minorities they feature on their council lists and then the actual voters. So they want to be more diverse than their own electorate, which I think indicates the cultural pressure they feel. At the same time, there is, I think, also a mistaken idea that somehow new arrivals within a lot of Western societies sort of find a natural home on the political left, whereas the processes in French of like embourgeoisement or the capacity for the right also to integrate some of these new arrivals should absolutely not be underestimated. And I think much of what you see on the far right is just a reflection of the fact that, yes, the political left is not the natural terminus for where many of these ethnic minorities are headed. In France, you see it very spectacularly with the National Rally, that they're now clearly drawing in a lot of voters that are, let's say, the children of North African migrants. So even there's a growing ethnic vote for the far right, which indicates the cultural victory, but at the same time also the fact that you cannot say that sociology is destiny. You can simply not assume that because people belong to a specific group, they will thereby vote a certain way.
Yeah, I'm interested also, I mean, slightly to go back to what you were saying about the Unite the Kingdom rally, but the idea, the question of geography, and I mean, because it still seems like, particularly in the UK, but also across Europe, there are certain sort of heartlands of, let's say, for the far right, maybe in Kent, for example, one would have a very different sense of, let's say, the national community than you would in London, even though you're only going sort of hour on the train. Yeah. I'm interested in how geography still plays a role within this kind of, what's the word?
Yes.
Is geography the grandfather of politics?
Well, once again, I think sociology is not destiny, geography is not destiny, but it obviously plays an enormously important role insofar as contemporary capitalism, particularly in Europe and the US, is highly regionally unequal and stratified. And I think it has to do with, I mean, the UK is the most regionally unequal country in the West. So the differences, let's say, between the North and London are larger than anything between Paris and, let's say, the ex-urban parts of France, that also compared to Germany. But it obviously has to do with the political economy of how many Western societies today function, in which so much money gets sucked into urban real estate, and then a lot of, let's say, finance and service industry are mainly concentrated in metropolitan areas. And then you have these increasing regions of people, of zones that are basically peripheral to where the actual economic action happens. And this indeed invites a kind of politics of the left behind, because you have people that for several reasons cannot afford or unable or don't want to live in these metropolitan areas, but then are left behind by history. And it's just very obvious that you can activate grievances about being left behind from, or not, let's say, moving at the same speed as some of these metropoles, which means that you have a really stark urban-rural divide, or sort of urban and non-urban divide. Suburban, yeah.
The white van man.
Exactly, which has reimposed itself in a lot of Western politics, and it's a particular problem for, let's say, parts of the new left in the 2010s, because it is inevitably subject to this new divide. It's a very heavily urban phenomenon. So if you look at Corbynism, it's very much phenomenon of the cities, and particularly it's a metropolitan leftism that also holds for Mélenchon and La France Insoumise in Paris, where the capacity to build a majority bloc inevitably has to include certain people that don't live in the cities. But because the organizational infrastructures and also the way they relate to the rest of society is much more brittle than anything you find in the city, that makes it very difficult. And it's almost sent us back to, let's say, a 19th century world, not economically insofar as then you had cities surrounded by seas of peasants, particularly in Europe. So you had the city, and this is where, let's say, the bourgeoisie and the industrial proletariat live, and then you had the peasantry that occupied the rest of the periphery. The peasantry obviously doesn't exist anymore, but at the same time you still have an urban-rural divide in which you have a politics that is very heavily urban and metropolitan, and then, let's say, a non-urban wasteland.
There's been a problem that with people who do politics is that they haven't been in the ability to theorize or to systematize this new types of inequality, these new types of stratification. Like, for example, not to be able to articulate a position that connects the underclass, let's say in metropolitan Westminster, with the people in the suburbs.
Yeah.
You know, there is a kind of an actually absence of like political language that has led to
I think there have been attempts, and I would say if you look at Corbynism also in the 2010s, it's not as if there was no capacity for outreach towards more non-metropolitan areas. There was a problem, I think, it was very typical in 2019, where Corbynism basically had to send buses up north with people who were mainly from the London area to do the door knocking before the general election, which was then lost against Boris Johnson's Tories, which I think indicates a connection between, let's say, the geographical problem we just indicated, so the urban-rural divide, which condemns a lot of leftism to an exclusively metropolitan orientation, and the fact that you don't have the organizational structures that can draw in people who you don't just want to talk to in election time. So if, let's say, someone who's a labor activist shows up on your doorstep once every 4 or 5 years to tell you, please vote for this person, and you don't hear about the party or what it's doing or the organizations intermittently, it's obviously not going to be an easy sell insofar as these people have no familiarity with what you're doing. And I think this is where the lack of institutions, which the book tries to look at, compounds with the geographic divide, namely the left behind areas are the place par excellence where under-institutionalization or the lack of institutionalization becomes an acute problem.
Yesterday, Francis Fukuyama tweeted about Kim Il-jung, the North Korean, just saying basically he had the right idea. Essentially, he was saying...
In terms of acquiring nuclear weapons?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
It was like basically, history didn't end, and actually the right thing to have done would have been to acquire nuclear weapons.
To build a bomb as quickly as possible.
Build a bomb as quickly as possible. I mean, and it made me think of Gaza and the current, the bombing of Iran that's going on, that actually history has kind of interjected itself into a kind of a post-historical illusion with violence, and it's an interesting thing that cuts across economic, linguistic, it cuts across everything, like I've told Tom this idea, the very first Gaza march I went to in Marble Arch, I was waiting to visit some people, and a bus arrived with lots of hijabi sisters from Yorkshire, and as they were getting off, the queer bloc, there's a bloc, I don't know if you know, there's the queer bloc, came out, and one of these young girls came out of the bus and sort of looked around for a brown face, and I'm bearded and brown, and came up to me and said, "Brother, are these people on our..." Because she just thought maybe they got off at the wrong place. "Are these people on our side?" And I was just like, yeah, just look at that's what the sign says, So there is a kind of a way that, like, something like Gaza has actually created a new dynamics that's is both old and new.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there are two things to notice. So this book is not a nostalgic book for the 90s and the 2000s. It very clearly tries to make clear that there is no sense in going back to the 90s and 2000s. It is not possible. And even though our contemporary public sphere might feel overheated, it might feel spasmodic, it might feel ineffectual, I think the fact that people feel involved in politics, or that they feel that they have a stake in what's happening with society's resources or on the level of foreign policy, is an enormously important change. And I certainly do not want this book to be read as nostalgic for an era in which people did not have to engage with it. In the end, it's also inevitable insofar as so much of history and politics is now beamed right into our smartphone screens, that it is very difficult for people not to feel politically, let's say, involved, or they have to formulate some response to all the horrors and all the surplus of politics they're constantly seeing. And that, I think, has made it possible for people to mobilize and also to create kinds of coalitions between groups that, as you mentioned, would otherwise not have joined together before. The question, once again, is that the new political activity is very difficult to institutionalize, both for a variety of reasons, partly because existing political institutions don't want members, and at the same time, we live in a kind of culture of distraction or a very fluid culture in which people can switch very easily from one topic to the other, which I think makes it difficult to build up a durable challenge to existing power structures. And foreign policy is the most dramatic domain for this, insofar as it's always been a part of, let's say, official state policy that's most shielded from democratic pressure. But I think it's become particularly extreme in the last 10 to 5 years, in that so much in terms of foreign policy decision making is now been outsourced to a very small set of people that don't reflect any popular constituency at all. So if you look at, for example, the opinion polling on current European involvement in the Iranian offensive, a vast majority of Europeans in almost every country are just radically opposed to it. Also in Britain, there is absolutely no majority for what the Starmer government is currently doing. But it doesn't matter, because foreign policy is just not a domain in which popular pressure in any way counts. Opinion polls can be safely ignored. And I think that is also one of the quandaries of the contemporary era, is that it's very good that people are mobilizing again. They have to, because as you say, history has returned in such a dramatic fashion. But it's not very clear what kind of tools there are now to basically exert pressure on these existing structures.
We have these kind of failed, the example of
your party,
But I mean, it seems a kind of a sort of case study in the difficulty of institutionalization, let's say, where there's an enormous amount of will, but
there's this distinct lack of talent, especially on the left, to build institutions, or even the right. I mean, reform is also best.
But
to be
you
honest.
can say that there's more success when using the Labour Party, an existing institution, rather than creating a new one, right?
I think this is one of the key questions of the 2010s, particularly for the left, that came out of the first protest wave after 2009, 2010. So if you look at, for example, Podemos in Spain, there was actually an outflow, an attempt to institutionalize the Indignados movement. The question is, do we found a new party? So do we enter the electoral arena with a completely novel organization, or do we, let's say, hijack or capture an existing sclerotic institution, as was the case with Corbyn and the Labour Party? It probably depends on what kind of voting system you have. So in a two-party system like the UK's, it's just not very easy to storm in with an entirely new outfit, while in Spain, which is a more multi-party system, it was easier. But yes, I think there is a loss of organizational talent, and there's an increasing difficulty to draw people into certain institutions. I think with your party, you very clearly see that because there is so little else before it, whether it's sort of unions or other civil society organizations, you kind of have to begin on a blank slate, and that, I think, invites all kinds of strange combinations. On the right, it's also an issue. So Reform, for example, has tried to create its own pub. They're now thinking of creating sort of local Reform chapters that can do the door knocking for council elections, etc., etc. But also they are, I think, subject to a party that's mostly Nigel Farage on his smartphone, and then a couple of people he chooses at whim. For a long time, Reform was not even registered as a party, it was just a corporation. So even the organizational structure is completely unlike what a political party would look like. There's one benefit or one advantage the right has, which is access to private funding. So
you mentioned that in your book, yes.
Yeah, because there are, let's say, large private lobbies that would like to sink their resources into these parties on the right, because they know that these parties will cater to their interests, which is not the case for the left. You can sort of camouflage the absence of a real mass base by purely getting private monies involved and thereby doing the job for you. And I think that is, the benefit which the right enjoys, is that there is just an access to private donors which the left does not have. At the same time, if the right wants to do something truly ambitious, it will have to construct something like a mass organization. So let's say if Reform wants to engage in its deportation program, which is something they've also taken from the Trump admin, I don't think this will work without a British state that's administratively capable enough to do this, and enough pressure from an organization that can actually engage this, as you see with ICE, for example, in the US. And I'm unsure whether Reform will be able to muster that type of organization.
Cool. I think it's a good place to wrap it up, lovely and depressing as it is.
And lovely and depressing is a good way to summarize what the book
thank
tries
you.
to
I think
do.
in the middle of the depression, I think what your book does so beautifully, I think in such a concise way, is to crystallize and to just clarify a lot of ambiguity and a kind of lack of cohesion, or a lot of discussions, a lot of
But
points.
what I'm generally proud of is that I only use the word woke once. So I say the attempt is saying, like, I want to talk about what's happening today, and I think I have something to say about it, but I'm not going to do it with these really stale shibboleths that have been completely overused. So without involving yourself or becoming a partisan in the culture wars, I hope to speak to the present,
exactly.
and this I think is exactly what the book set out to do.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.